Please remember, none of this is financial advice.
Baseball
Cups constantly and quietly being filled. The trick is knowing how to tip ourselves over and let the beautiful stuff out. Ray Bradbury.
We're living off of an antiquated system that was a hodgepodge of things that got put together.
Do you think that tech companies have a role to play in making this financial system safer?
Absolutely. I mean, look, without the intelligence, the sophistication of the tech industry, I think it would be virtually impossible. But, you know, that's the history of the United States, right? I mean, the aircraft companies that developed, you know, sophisticated new planes and bombers in the Second World War, it was all done by the private sector. So, you know, historically, the private sector is always called upon to take a leadership role. It just is that we need to define the problem. And I've identified the problem. I haven't defined it exactly because I don't know what all the pieces of this thing are. And that's a lot of work to figure out the pieces. And that's what I think right now central banks and governments should be doing, a coordinated effort of figuring the whole thing out and then going to people to work on trying to create solutions. I think letting government do it themselves will take too long and it'll be too expensive.
The private sector leads the way in innovation. Blockchain is trust and security. The XRP ledger has been in existence since 2012 with incentive to be hacked, but has never been hacked. Governments around the world are trying to create solutions that the private sector has already solved. Governments and central banks are not financially motivated, therefore inefficient, and time is ticking away.
Number one, that these pilot projects trying to link national CBDC platforms and alternative designs that are intended to integrate them on a single blockchain are very, very far from practical implementation, and that this is the opposite of usual economics. Usual economics is to show that what works in practice can work in theory. Here, I think we have the opposite problem, that we can show how these bridges work in theory, but getting them to work in practice, specifically from the point of view of governance, who is going to oversee the operation of these platforms. That's going to be a very hard nut to crack. And secondly, I'm going to argue that there are so many private initiatives ongoing in the cross-border payment sphere that the need for central banks to solve this problem is far from obvious. This may simply be a case where we can leave it to the private sector to bring down the current high costs of cross-border transactions. So examples of that, and I think that once again kind of makes my point. There is a company Ripple a few miles from here in San Francisco that has partnered with a big multinational bank to do its interbank cross-border payments at lower cost in less time. So again, I think we see a lot of partnerships and innovations in the private sector that are effectively accomplishing, in terms of cost and speed, what interoperable CBDCs are intended to do.
Barry, that once worked at the IMF, says that these central bank projects are, quote, very far. He also mentions that even if they did build this, who's going to govern these platforms? With a trustless ledger, with a decentralized public ledger, there is no need to trust any one party. As Barry says, this might be a case for the private sector, specifically Ripple, to bring the cost of cross-border payments down. In other words, why reinvent the wheel if the private sector has already invented it?
Opinion was, this is something that is an interesting technology from a financial point of view, from a technology point of view, and we need to learn about it. So we saw some of the first labs launch, begin to explore with internal experiments. I think banks very quickly concluded that it's not so much about the coin that's interesting, it's more about the ledger This idea that you could have a universal golden record that serves as the ledger system among parties that don't necessarily fully trust each other, because in many respects, the banking industry has some of those characteristics. We do business with each other. We don't fully trust each other. We do business with each other. And we have a huge, complex set of record-keeping systems, core bank systems, etc., that have been replicated by all the banks in the world, replicated again by all the non-bank financial institutions in the world. And the idea is simply there to make sure that my books and records are the same but opposite of your books and records, multiplied by 30,000 banks in the world, multiplied by 1 million non-bank financial institutions, etc. So, this idea that the system that we have today of many banks, many ledgers, many record-keeping systems, which has kind of grown organically. It hasn't really been designed that way, but it's grown organically over hundreds of years. That maybe there's an opportunity to re-architect some of it as we move from a system of many banks, many ledgers to maybe many banks, fewer ledgers. Simple as that. I don't think that there'll be one single ledger that's a record-keeping system for everything. In the financial industry, maybe there's a ledger for payments, maybe there's a ledger for private securities, maybe there's another one for public securities or equities or bonds or derivatives, etc. We will see that story tell itself out. But I think that
The XRP ledger is an open source technology that caters to payments. It's trustless that anybody can use for free but needs XRP. The problem with today's system is that there's a series of accounts that have trust relationships, and the payments need to go through one bank that has trust with another that has trust with another, and it's a series of transactions until it gets to the bank that is needed. Imagine a golden ledger that everybody can join and transact on without relying on those trusted relationships. But at the same time, if trusted relationships are desired, a trust line can be set up. The XRP ledger is optimized for technology like Codius and Interledger Protocol, meaning that the design knew in advance that one ledger will not rule them all, and there are ways for all ledgers to communicate.
Nick should correct me if I get it wrong, whether the M-bridge linking the two is likely to be not only workable in theory, but also workable in practice. And it seems to me that the practice is the hard part. So minting and burning national CBDCs sounds like a mechanical process, but someone, a licensed dealer, a commercial bank, is going to have to sit in the middle holding inventories of the relevant depository receipts into which those national CBDCs are going to be converted when they are burned and minted, respectively. Who exactly are these designated dealers going to be? Are they going to be the commercial bank about who we just heard? Who is going to be sure that their inventories are adequate? Who is going to decide who is licensed in this domain and not? So I think this is a complicated question for two central banks to agree on, but a very detailed arrangement involving two central banks is not going to solve the globe's cross-border payments problems. So I applaud the Bank of Thailand and the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and their efforts to explore these problems. And I applaud the BIS's encouragement for other central banks to join their design. But are 180 central banks globally going to be able to agree on who the designated dealers are, what adequate inventories are, who is going to provide oversight of this arrangement? I think the resulting arrangements would be more complicated than the governance arrangements to which the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization.
The CBDC designs that are being piloted are just raising more questions than giving answers. Who is going to govern? Who will be the central intermediaries that can mint and burn? The BIS and these central bank pilots are recreating the same problems. A trustless system is the answer.
Organizations are increasingly recognizing that their business models will prevent them from remaining competitive. Today's market drivers present profound business opportunities for organizations who are willing to explore new operating systems, technology platforms, and service models. And let's recognize that digital assets are a prime vehicle that can disrupt nearly every facet of the financial markets and act as a driving force for positive change. Luckily, that presents an opportunity for all of us and all of you to capitalize on this moment. Pioneers like you are the ones that can write the future of finance. Many of you have already deployed multi-party applications into production and have integrated digital assets into your core business activities. What distinguishes you from everyone else is that you share R3's vision of the future, which is interconnected and backed by digital trust.
Digital assets can disrupt every facet of the financial markets and can be a driving force for positive change. Corda is a private permission system that hosts updated walled gardens. He states that most at CordaCon have already adopted digital assets. Distributed walled gardens is of little use if it cannot connect to the Internet of Value. It certainly sounds like there are a lot getting ready to connect to the IOV.
History. Layer over layer, civilizations have left their mark, and beneath, quite literally, we find an architectural miracle. The aqueducts, the pipes, the sewers built by Roman engineers nearly 2,000 years ago to provide modern living standards to a city of over 1 million people. So what is it? A plumbing system that continues to be used, hidden, yet so essential. And today I will speak about another form of hidden infrastructure, just as essential, the plumbing of modern payment systems. Unlike those of ancient Rome, today's cross-border payment pipes will not last for anything close to another 2,000 years. In fact, if you are to be honest, these pipes need an urgent upgrade now. As most people know, cross-border payments today are often slow, expensive, opaque, cumbersome, and for some people, inaccessible.
Everybody in the banking system knows that cross-border payments need to change, and they need to change in a hurry.
The number one risk that we're really vulnerable to is the sustainability of the global payment system. And I choose the word sustainability over the word vulnerability because the real key here is keeping the global payment system running. And we've had so many hacks, terrorist attacks, the Colonial Pipeline incident. It would appear to me that we are extremely vulnerable to having an attack against the payment system of the financial markets, and not just here in the United States, but in Europe. And so, what I'm really talking about is things like the Fed wire, where all the bank's money, clears through. But then also something like the Depository Trust Corporation, the DCC, SWIFT, Euroclear. I mean, I can just keep going on and on and on. And if there was a synchronized attack, we would essentially bring the global financial markets to its knees. And probably the first response would be that securities prices would crash. And the second issue would be that we would probably have to close all the exchanges and in the world potentially in order to figure out how we restore the global payment system.
The payment infrastructure is a target and systemically important. I believe at one point a vulnerability is going to be exposed and there will be a rush to update. When the legacy system freezes, there will be an exodus to digital assets. Businesses, banks, institutions can still operate using digital assets. There will be a fight or flight moment where they use unregulated digital assets to keep their banks afloat. Valued member and researcher of the XRP community, Leonidas, has discovered that RippleNet has grown to over 500 plus institutions. A network being built by the private sector is gaining traction, and the more users that join the network, the more valuable it will become. Metcalfe's law.
Rely on. And in the whole space, you can ask a question, what's the reason why people in the particular countries are not using their own currency to trade in and are relying on a currency from a foreign country? Again, my first point on my previous remark, it's the issue of trust.
In a world of easy monetary policy and high inflation, there is a real need for trustless ledgers and currencies.
So if a really dominant currency, if the system is going to change after you have a dominant currency, we've only got two observations here, unfortunately, about how that works. So, one should always be very careful when you only have two data points. But the first thing is the fact there are only two of them and there have only been three dominant currencies suggests that the incumbency in those network externalities I just talked about are pretty darn strong. Secondly, when the actual transitions happen, and again, two data points, so let's be clear here, but there are commonalities. One, they take decades. They don't happen quickly. Secondly, they tend to happen with amidst periods of pretty large global economic disruptions, and often policy mistakes, and not just by the dominant currency country, by the way. The third characteristic is war, multiple wars. Let me repeat, one should never extrapolate too much from only two data points. But history does suggest that we should be thinking really carefully about transitions, given the changes that are going on in the global financial system, really carefully, because the last characteristic is not one that we would presumably want to repeat. So what does all this have to do with the digitalization of money, of currency? Well, first of all, the degree that digitalization can increase the efficiency of payments and financial transactions is clearly important. And the question is, to what extent could digital currencies lower even further some of those transactions costs that I mentioned earlier? I think potentially significantly, but of course that depends on the design. That said, given the huge size and the volatility of transactions and capital flows, particularly in a dominant currency, it's not a small undertaking to figure out how to gain those efficiencies, to be clear. And I'm sure that the central banks that are doing this are being careful about it. And I'm looking forward to the discussion of interoperability that I think that the other panelists are going to have.
The global reset takes decades, is accompanied with economic disruptions, with monetary policy mistakes, not necessarily the U.S. However, I believe the U.S. is being careless with monetary policy, but it could be any nation's monetary policy that has a ripple effect in the global economy as well as multiple wars. I was not predicting the future, I was trying to prevent it. Ray Bradbury. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. If you hit the like button, share, and comment, the YouTube algorithms will suggest my videos to others. If you're interested, I have a Patreon where you can support this channel directly. We have weekly discussions, Discord, raw footage, and crypto research.